21 years. That is all the time that separated one world war from the next. In 1939, as autumn painted the trees gold across America, mothers who had buried their sons in French soil watched their grandsons reach military age. The arithmetic was cruel and precise. In 1917, America had sent 2 million men across the Atlantic Ocean. 116,500 never returned. Now, Europe was calling again. Before we continue this journey, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extraordinary for you. Consider for a moment what $17 billion meant in 1939. It was the sum that Britain and France still owed America from the last war, a debt they could not pay, would not pay, and resented being asked to pay. Convert that figure to today's currency, and you approach $300 billion. This was not merely an accounting entry in some government ledger. This was memory made tangible, sacrifice converted into numbers that appeared in newspapers beside stories of European powers marching toward war again. The debt poisoned every conversation about intervention. How could America be asked to save nations that hadn't honored their promises from the last salvation? The mathematics of profit haunted the discussion as well. In the 1930s, a Senate committee led by Gerald Nye had performed an autopsy on the previous war, and what they discovered in the entrails of industry turned stomachs across the nation. 21 American corporations had extracted combined profits of $200 million from the conflict. DuPont's earnings alone had increased by 1,100% between 1914 and 1918. The chemistry company that supplied explosives to destroy men had grown extraordinarily wealthy from their destruction. These were not accusations, whispered in radical pamphlets. These were facts documented in congressional hearings, printed in mainstream newspapers, discussed at dinner tables from Maine to California. Into this atmosphere of cynicism and memory stepped Charles Lindbergh. The aviator who had conquered the Atlantic now commanded audiences that filled stadiums. 30,000 people at a time came to hear him speak. His fame was a weapon, and he wielded it with precision. At Madison Square Garden, in Hollywood Bowl, in parks and auditoriums across the nation, he delivered the same message. Europe's wars were not America's wars. The Atlantic Ocean was not merely geography, but destiny, a barrier that nature had provided to separate the New World from the Old World's endless cycles of bloodshed. But Lindbergh was only the most visible face of a much larger resistance. In small towns throughout Kansas and Iowa, in Nebraska and the Dakotas, an army was forming. These were the Gold Star Mothers, women who had hung flags in their windows during the last war, flags with stars that honored sons serving overseas. For those whose sons never returned, the stars had turned gold, a permanent memorial to permanent loss. Now these mothers organized. They remembered the promises made when their boys marched away in 1917. This was the war to end all wars. This was the war to make the world safe for democracy. These promises had proven to be lies. The Gold Star Mothers formed chapters, raised funds, organized rallies, and wrote letters. Their movement grew to 800,000 members, 800,000 Americans, who had direct, personal, intimate reasons to resist European entanglement. Their arithmetic was simpler and more brutal than any economist's calculation. 1 son plus 1 war equals 1 grave. The equation had already been solved once. They would not solve it again. The chemistry of American public opinion crystallized around their pain. Polling, that relatively new science of measuring the national mood, revealed extraordinary consensus. 96% of Americans opposed entering another European war. 96%. In a democracy as diverse and divided as America, such unanimity was almost unheard of. This was not mere sentiment, but measurable force, a resistance as real as gravity. The government responded with legislation designed to make intervention impossible. The Neutrality Acts emerged like layers of armor. Each piece added after a specific betrayal revealed a new vulnerability. The first act came in 1935, after Benito Mussolini invaded Ethiopia using American oil to fuel his tanks and American trucks to carry his soldiers. The second followed Germany's remilitarization of the Rhineland, accomplished with American steel that had been sold to build bridges and factories, but was forged into weapons instead. These laws were not abstract policy. They contained specific, measurable prohibitions. American. Citizens could not sell arms to belligerent nations. American ships could not carry war materials to combat zones. American banks could not loan money to governments at war. The legislation attempted to build a legal wall as impenetrable as the ocean itself, ensuring that America would remain separate from whatever horror Europe was preparing to unleash. Yet beneath the surface of public consensus, invisible currents pulled in opposite directions. In the offices of America's largest banks, calculations of a different sort were being performed. American financial institutions had loaned Germany $6 billion during the 1920s, capital that had rebuilt German industry after the devastation of the First War. Now that industry served the Third Reich. If America sided with Britain against Germany, those loans would vanish like smoke. If Germany conquered Europe, perhaps those debts would be honored. The mathematics of money created incentives that ran counter to the mathematics of morality. Bernard Baruch, the financier who had coordinated American war production in 1917 and 1918, brought this information to President Franklin Roosevelt in a private meeting. He showed the president intercepted cables from German banks, communications that revealed the scope of American financial entanglement with the Reich. The choice, Baruch explained, was not between intervention and isolation. The choice was between different kinds of loss, either American lives or American treasure. But not both could be preserved. Roosevelt listened, asked questions, revealed nothing of his own calculations. He was already playing a game that operated on multiple levels simultaneously, like chess in 3 dimensions. What the public saw was not what was happening. What was happening was not what was being said. The president spoke of neutrality, while his mind worked through equations of inevitable involvement. The thermodynamics of opinion began to show measurable change after September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and Europe's uneasy peace collapsed into open war. Each week brought news that tested isolationist resolve. German armies conquered Poland in 27 days. The speed was shocking. The efficiency was terrifying. The weapons were more devastating than anything seen in the previous war. When France fell in June 1940, France, which had held against German assault for 4 years in the last war, the collapse required only 6 weeks. The seemingly impossible had occurred. The mathematics of European power had been recalculated, and the answers were unthinkable. American newspapers showed photographs of German soldiers standing beneath the Arc de Triomphe, Nazi flags flying above the Palace of Versailles, Hitler touring Paris as a conqueror. Britain stood alone now, an island enduring aerial bombardment that killed 43,000 civilians in 1940 alone. The English Channel, that narrow strip of water, was all that separated Nazi-controlled Europe from total victory. If Britain fell, America would face an Atlantic Ocean dominated by hostile powers possessing navies that could reach American shores. The poles began to shift. Not dramatically, not quickly, but measurably. By December 1940, 96% opposition to war had declined to 88%. 8 percentage points represented approximately 10 million Americans who had changed their assessment of the equation. The Gold Star Mothers still organized. Charles Lindbergh still drew stadium crowds. The America First Committee still commanded 850,000 members and $15 million in funding. But the ground beneath their resistance had begun to move. In living rooms across America, families gathered around radio sets to hear Edward R. Murrow, broadcast from London during German air raids. His voice, steady amid the sound of explosions, brought the war into American homes with visceral immediacy. "This is London," he would begin, and then describe what it meant to stand on a rooftop watching bombs fall on a city, watching buildings collapse, watching fires spread, while families huddled in shelters below. The war was no longer abstract, no longer merely European. It had become personal through the intimate medium of radio, through one man's voice carrying across the Atlantic the sounds and sensations of a civilization under assault. The chemistry of American opinion was changing state, like ice beginning to thaw. The solid consensus of isolation was becoming liquid, beginning to flow in new directions, not all of it, not quickly, but inevitably. The mothers who had lost sons in the last war found themselves in painful arguments with daughters who asked, "What if Britain falls? What if democracy dies in Europe while America watches? What if isolation means abandoning every value America claims to hold?" These were not easy questions. There were no easy answers. By the end of 1940, America stood at a crossroads it did not wish to acknowledge. The nation had built walls of legislation, mobilized movements of resistance, and expressed near-unanimous opposition to foreign involvement. Yet the world was changing around it, refusing to honor America's desire to remain separate. The ocean that had protected the nation for a century and a half seemed somehow smaller now, less reliable, as German U-boats prowled its waters and German bombers demonstrated they could cross hundreds of miles to strike cities. The equation that seemed so simple in 1939, Europe's wars were not America's wars, was becoming more complex with each passing month. Variables were being added that nobody had anticipated. The mathematics was changing. The chemistry was transforming. The physics of isolationism was encountering forces that would test whether neutrality was truly possible in a world where empires called for blood again, where the last war's promises had failed, and where a new generation stood watching horizons darken with approaching storms they had not created, but could not escape. 21 years. That is all the time that separated one world war from the next. And time, as Americans would soon learn, was running out. While America constructed its walls of neutrality, while Congress debated legislation and mothers organized resistance, 4 wars already raged across the planet. These conflicts would determine the future of civilization, yet most Americans knew almost nothing about them. The newspapers that filled front pages with Hollywood gossip and World's Fair attractions relegated distant battles to small columns on inner pages. But distance, as it turned out, was an illusion. The largest war measured by territory, by casualties, by sheer human suffering was burning across China. Since 1937, Japanese armies had conquered 1 million square miles of Chinese territory. 1 million square miles. To comprehend this scale, imagine if a foreign power had occupied every state east of the Mississippi River. The Japanese advance had killed 4 million Chinese civilians by 1941. 4 million people. The number is so vast it loses meaning, becomes abstract, but each number was a person, a farmer burned out of his village, a mother killed in an air raid, a child starved by occupying forces. American newspapers barely reported this Holocaust, while Shirley Temple's latest film received front-page coverage. The rape of Nanking, where Japanese soldiers murdered between 200,000 and 300,000 civilians in 6 weeks, appeared as a brief item on page 17. The New York World's Fair of 1939 drew millions of visitors who marveled at the world of tomorrow, while the world of today burned on the far side of the Pacific. Yet America was not truly neutral in China. In the mountains of Yunnan province, American pilots flew missions for Chiang Kai-shek's forces under false identities. They were called volunteers, but they flew American-made planes, used American tactics, and received American payments, $1,000 for every Japanese aircraft they destroyed. By December 1941, 23 of these pilots had died in combat. 23 Americans killed in a war their nation claimed not to be fighting. The mathematics of this secret involvement followed precise equations. Each American pilot trained 12 Chinese pilots. Each Chinese pilot flew an average of 4 missions per month. Each mission destroyed Japanese equipment that would otherwise advance further into Chinese territory. The effect rippled outward. Japanese divisions tied down in China could not deploy to other theaters, could not threaten other territories, could not pursue other conquests. American intervention, though unofficial and unacknowledged, was changing the trajectory of the Pacific War before that war officially existed. Consider what was happening simultaneously in Spain. From 1936 to 1939, a civil war had transformed that nation into a testing ground for the weapons and tactics that would soon devastate Europe. The Spanish conflict was not merely Spaniards fighting Spaniards. It was a proxy war, where fascist powers supported Francisco Franco's forces while democratic nations watched, constrained by their own neutrality laws. The German Condor Legion arrived in Spain to perfect techniques they would later employ across Europe. On April 26, 1937, they attacked the Basque town of Guernica. The assault lasted 3 hours and 20 minutes. Waves of bombers struck the market day crowd with high explosives and incendiaries. When the smoke cleared, 1,654 civilians lay dead. The town burned for 3 days. Pablo Picasso immortalized the horror in a painting, but the true legacy of Guernica was tactical. The Germans had learned precisely how to terrorize civilian populations from the air. American neutrality laws forbade citizens from fighting in foreign wars. But 3,200 Americans joined the Abraham Lincoln Brigade to fight fascism in Spain. They were students and workers, idealists and adventurers, communists and Democrats united by the conviction that Spain was where the line must be drawn. They fought at Jarama, at Brunete, at Teruel. They learned that conviction alone cannot stop tanks, that idealism does not deflect bullets. 900 never returned home. Their deaths were officially meaningless. They had died in a conflict America was not involved in, for a cause America did not support. In violation of laws America had passed to prevent exactly such sacrifice, but their sacrifice revealed a fundamental truth about neutrality. It was always selective, always political, always a choice about whose side not to take rather than a pure stance of non-involvement. America remained neutral towards Spain while selling oil to Italy and scrap steel to Japan. The neutrality served specific interests while abandoning others to their fate. The Third Secret War raged across the North Atlantic, in waters Americans believed peaceful. Since 1940, German U-boats had been waging unrestricted submarine warfare against Britain's supply lines. They sank 3 million tons of shipping that year, 3 million tons of food, fuel, weapons, and raw materials sent to the bottom of the Atlantic. Each ship that went down represented not just cargo but lives, merchant sailors drowned in freezing water, crews trapped in sinking vessels, men killed by explosions or burned by flaming oil. American ships officially stayed clear of combat zones, but the definition of combat zones kept changing as German submarines ranged farther from their bases. By mid-1941, an undeclared naval war had erupted. President Roosevelt had authorized American destroyers to escort British convoys halfway across the Atlantic to a point called MOMP, Mid-Ocean Meeting Point. The British would escort ships from Britain to MOMP. Americans would escort from MOMP to Iceland, then hand off to British escorts again. This was not neutrality. This was active military support for one side of a war America claimed not to be part of. The fiction became impossible to maintain when German torpedoes started hitting American warships. On September 4, 1941, the USS Greer detected a German U-boat and tracked it for hours, radioing its position to British aircraft that dropped depth charges. The U-boat fired 3 torpedoes at the Greer in self-defense. All missed. Roosevelt announced the attack as unprovoked German aggression. On October 17, 1941, the USS Kearney took a torpedo while defending a British convoy south of Iceland. The explosion killed 11 American sailors instantly. The destroyer survived and limped into port, but American blood had been spilled. Roosevelt gave a speech declaring that the shooting had started, that American ships had been attacked on the high seas. He did not mention that those ships were actively helping Britain fight Germany. 2 weeks later, on October 31st, the USS Reuben James was escorting another British convoy when a German torpedo struck her port side. The explosion detonated the forward magazine. The ship broke in half and sank in 5 minutes. 115 sailors died. Only 44 survived. This was 7 weeks before Pearl Harbor, 7 weeks before America officially entered the war. 115 American sailors dead in a war their nation claimed not to be fighting. The names of the dead were not widely publicized. Their families received official condolences that somehow avoided explaining how their sons had died while America was at peace. The newspapers that did report the sinking placed it on inside pages, as if acknowledging it too prominently would raise questions about what American warships were doing in combat zones, protecting British merchant vessels, fighting German submarines. The Fourth Secret War was the most secret of all, and potentially the most consequential. In basement laboratories at Columbia University, the University of Chicago, and the University of California at Berkeley, American scientists raced to split atoms before German researchers accomplished the same feat. The physics had been understood since 1938, when German chemists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann had successfully split uranium atoms in Berlin. The implications were immediately apparent to physicists worldwide. The energy released from splitting atoms could power cities or destroy them. In August 1939, Albert Einstein had signed a letter to President Roosevelt explaining that nuclear fission could lead to bombs of Prozovo, unprecedented power, and that German scientists were almost certainly pursuing this goal. The letter sat on Roosevelt's desk for 2 months before he acted. When he did, he authorized a research program that officially did not exist, funded through accounts that officially had no money, pursuing a goal that officially was impossible. By 1941, the program had acquired 6 tons of uranium oxide from the Belgian Congo, purchased secretly, transported covertly, stored in locations known to only a handful of people. The uranium sat in warehouses, while mathematicians calculated whether a sustained chain reaction was possible, while engineers designed machinery that had never been built, while administrators planned industrial facilities that would eventually employ 130,000 people in a project whose purpose they could not be told. This was happening while Charles Lindbergh told stadium crowds that America should avoid entanglement. This was happening while Congress debated whether to expand the army from 200,000 to 400,000 men. This was happening while polls showed overwhelming opposition to war. The Manhattan Project, though it did not yet have that name, represented a commitment to future conflict that made current neutrality debates meaningless. Consider the interconnection of these 4 wars. American pilots fighting in China learned lessons about Japanese tactics that would prove crucial at Midway. American volunteers dying in Spain demonstrated fascism's willingness to wage total war on civilians, preparing America psychologically for what was coming. American sailors killed in the Atlantic created precedents for unrestricted warfare that would justify later actions. American scientists splitting atoms in secret laboratories were ensuring that when war came, America would possess weapons that could end it. These wars were not separate from each other or from America. They were threads in a web that encircled the globe, and America was already caught in that web, whether it acknowledged the fact or not. The official neutrality was a fiction maintained for domestic political consumption, a story Americans told themselves, while their sons flew combat missions, sailed into combat zones, and built weapons of unprecedented destruction. The energy flowing into these conflicts followed the laws of thermodynamics. It could neither be created nor destroyed, only transformed. American oil became motion for Japanese tanks in China. American steel became structure for German submarines in the Atlantic. American uranium would become energy in chain reactions that would reshape civilization. The neutrality laws tried to build barriers against this energy transfer, but energy finds pathways around barriers, through them, or it builds until it breaks them entirely. By December 1941, 27,000 American merchant sailors had died in the North Atlantic, killed while transporting goods to Britain in vessels that were technically civilian but were targets nonetheless. These deaths went largely unacknowledged, these sailors unremembered, because acknowledging them would mean admitting America was already at war. The fiction of peace required forgetting the dead. 27,000 is a number comparable to American combat deaths in the Korean War, more than American combat deaths in the first 4 years of the Vietnam War. These sailors died before Pearl Harbor, died while America claimed neutrality. died in a war their nation pretended not to be fighting. Their sacrifice revealed the fundamental dishonesty of official neutrality. America was involved, America was fighting, America was dying. The only question was when the official story would catch up to the reality. The secret wars burned on every continent except Antarctica and South America. They consumed lives and resources at rates that made the previous World War seem almost modest by comparison. And America, despite its oceans and its legislation and its overwhelming public opinion against involvement, was already burning in those fires. The smoke had not yet reached most American homes, the flames had not yet forced recognition, but the combustion was underway, and it was irreversible. The physics of these interconnected conflicts created forces that no policy could permanently resist. Each secret involvement created consequences that demanded further involvement. Each American death in unofficial combat created survivors who would demand acknowledgement. Each scientific breakthrough toward atomic weapons made eventual use more likely. The system was building toward a critical threshold, a point where the accumulated pressure of secret wars would exceed the containing force of official neutrality, and the explosion would transform everything. That threshold was approaching. The calendar was advancing. And time, as sailors dying in the Atlantic and pilots falling over China already knew, was the one resource that neutrality could not preserve. Two massive propaganda machines battled for America's soul with the precision and ruthlessness of modern warfare. They deployed words as weapons, emotions as ammunition, and public opinion as the territory to be conquered. The struggle was invisible to most Americans, who believed they were forming their own opinions through rational assessment of facts. But the facts themselves were being manufactured, curated, and delivered through channels controlled by forces with specific agendas. The America First Committee represented the largest grassroots political organization in American history to that point. 850,000 members had joined by mid-1941. 850,000 Americans who paid dues, attended rallies, distributed literature, and organized locally to resist intervention. The committee commanded $15 million in funding, equivalent to nearly $300 million today. This was not a fringe movement or a collection of cranks. This was mainstream America, organized and mobilized. 450 chapters operated across the nation, from major cities to small towns. Each chapter held weekly meetings, distributed pamphlets, organized letter-writing campaigns to Congress, and recruited new members. The operation ran with corporate efficiency because it was funded by corporate leaders, the heads of Sears Roebuck, Sterling, Morton Salt, Hormel Meatpacking, and other major American businesses. These were not ideologues or extremists. These were practical businessmen who understood that war meant government control of industry, massive taxation, and disruption of profitable trade relationships. Every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 23 million Americans tuned their radio sets to hear the same message delivered by different speakers. Charles Lindbergh remained the most prominent voice, but he was hardly alone. Senators spoke, historians lectured, mothers testified about their losses from the last war. The message was consistent. Europe's wars were ancient tribal conflicts that America had no stake in. Intervention would cost American lives and treasure while solving nothing. Democracy could not be imposed by military force. America's role was to preserve freedom by example, not by conquest. The rhetoric was sophisticated, the arguments carefully constructed. They did not defend fascism or dismiss Nazi atrocities. Instead, they questioned whether American military power could eliminate fascism without becoming fascist itself. They asked whether a nation that still practiced racial segregation should lecture Europe about human rights. They pointed out that Britain and France were colonial empires ruling hundreds of millions of non-white subjects. Were those subjects freer than Germans under Hitler? The questions were designed to create doubt, to complicate simple moral equations, to make intervention seem hypocritical rather than heroic. Financial records seized after Pearl Harbor revealed the true sources of America First funding. Beyond the corporate donors, money flowed from sources that complicated the committee's patriotic image. Some funds originated in German-American Bund accounts, Some came from corporations that did extensive business with Nazi Germany. Some came from individuals who admired fascism even while claiming to merely advocate American neutrality. The committee leaders likely did not know all their funding sources, but the money carried influence that shaped messaging in subtle ways. Against this domestic machine, a foreign intelligence operation conducted psychological warfare on American soil, with a scope and sophistication that would be illegal if discovered. British security coordination operated from the 36th floor of Rockefeller Center in New York City. The address was 630 Fifth Avenue. The office appeared to be a routine British import-export company. Actually, it employed 3,000 agents conducting covert operations designed to bring America into the war. The operation was run by William Stevenson, a Canadian businessman and spy master who reported directly to Winston Churchill. His budget was effectively unlimited. Britain was fighting for survival and would spend whatever necessary to secure American involvement. The mission was to manipulate American public opinion through means that violated every neutrality law and would constitute foreign interference in domestic politics if exposed. British security coordination planted stories in American newspapers. They created fake grassroots organizations that appeared to be American citizens, spontaneously advocating intervention. They funded interventionist rallies and provided speakers. They infiltrated isolationist organizations to create division and scandals. They forged documents showing German plans to threaten the Western Hemisphere. They operated a secret radio station that broadcast content designed to make Nazi Germany appear more threatening. Station WRUL transmitted on shortwave from Massachusetts, reaching 15 million American homes with programming that seemed educational but was actually precision-crafted psychological warfare. A typical broadcast might feature a German exile describing Nazi atrocities. The exile was actually a British agent. The stories were true, but selected for maximum emotional impact. Another broadcast might present intercepted German communications, discussing plans to conquer South America. The communications were fabricated, but listeners had no way to verify their authenticity. The operation extended into Hollywood, where British agents worked with sympathetic producers and directors to shape how movies portrayed the European conflict. Films like Confessions of a Nazi Spy and The Great Dictator served British interests by depicting Nazis as buffoons or monsters. These were not subtle propaganda pieces, but entertainment that carried messages. Audiences laughed at Charlie Chaplin's Hitler parody while absorbing the subtext that fascism was ridiculous and must be opposed. British security coordination maintained files on hundreds of American journalists, politicians, and business leaders. They knew who could be influenced, who could be manipulated, who could be trusted. They provided scoops to friendly journalists, funding to sympathetic politicians, and business opportunities to cooperative executives. The web of influence was invisible but extensive, touching newspapers that reached tens of millions of readers daily. Franklin Roosevelt himself orchestrated a third propaganda machine, one that operated from the White House with constitutional authority but similar manipulative intent. His fireside chats reached 62 million listeners, more than half the American population. He spoke directly to citizens in their living rooms, his voice intimate and reassuring, explaining complex international situations in simple terms that always led to the same conclusion. America must support democracies against dictators. The president understood that repetition creates truth in the public mind. He did not argue the same point once, but returned to it again and again, from different angles, with different examples, until the message became accepted wisdom. He used rhetorical questions that led listeners to his conclusions, while making them feel they had reached those conclusions independently. When your neighbor's house is on fire, he would ask, "Do you refuse to lend him your garden hose?" The metaphor made Lend-Lease seem like simple neighborly assistance rather than a $50 billion commitment that made war inevitable. Movie newsreels, shown before every film in every theater, reached 80 million Americans weekly. The content of these newsreels was not regulated or neutral. Studios decided what footage to show and how to narrate it. Roosevelt maintained close relationships with studio heads, who understood that cooperation with the administration could prove valuable in countless ways. The newsreels increasingly showed German aggression and British suffering, creating emotional connections that transcended rational debate about national interests. In October 1941, Roosevelt displayed a map at a press conference that supposedly showed German plans to conquer South America. The map detailed how Nazi Germany intended to divide Latin America into 5 puppet states under German control. The revelation created headlines, validating fears that Hitler's ambitions extended to the Western Hemisphere. Isolationists who argued that Germany posed no threat to America suddenly seemed naive or dishonest. The map was a forgery created by British security coordination. Roosevelt knew it was fake. He displayed it anyway because it served his purpose of demonstrating German threats to Americans, who believed the Atlantic Ocean provided perfect protection. The lie was tactical, instrumental, justified in his mind by the greater truth that Germany did pose a threat, even if this particular evidence was manufactured. The thermodynamics of persuasion followed measurable laws. Each German victory added energy to interventionist arguments. France falls, polls shift 2 percentage points toward intervention. Germany bombs London, another 3 points. German submarines sink American ships, 4 more points. The movement was gradual but directional, like water flowing downhill. Each event created momentum that made the next shift easier. Meanwhile, each British defeat drained isolationist resistance. Britain was supposed to be the mighty empire that ruled a quarter of the globe. If Britain could not defend itself, how could American assistance possibly matter? But Britain kept fighting despite devastating losses, and the persistence created admiration. By late 1941, polls showed a majority of Americans wanted Britain to win, even if a majority still opposed sending American troops. The contradiction revealed confused thinking that propaganda machines could exploit. The equation balanced on a knife's edge. 722 newspapers supported isolation versus 360 advocating intervention. The isolationist press had numerical superiority, but the interventionist papers were located in larger cities. Circulation figures revealed that interventionist newspapers reached 22 million readers daily, while isolationist papers reached 17 million. 5 million more Americans received news filtered through interventionist perspectives every single day. Radio told a similar story. The major networks NBC, CBS, Mutual all leaned interventionist in their news coverage. Not overtly, not through obvious bias, but through selection of which stories received prominent coverage, which experts were interviewed, how events were described. A German victory was a conquest, while a British victory was liberation. German bombing was terror, while British bombing was strategic. The language shaped perception even when the facts remained the same. Local radio stations were different. In small towns and rural areas, stations were often owned by isolationist businessmen who programmed content accordingly. These stations broadcast America First speeches, played interviews with skeptical senators, and provided platforms for mothers who opposed intervention. But local stations had limited reach, typically 20 to 50 miles. Network radio reached across the nation, giving interventionist messages structural advantages in the battle for public opinion. The propaganda war extended into churches, schools, civic organizations, and union halls. Ministers debated whether Christianity demanded pacifism or required opposing evil with force. Teachers discussed current events with students, knowing that today's teenagers would be tomorrow's soldiers. Rotary clubs and Kiwanis chapters hosted speakers from both sides. Union leaders split over whether war would create jobs or create graves. Consider the complexity of what ordinary Americans faced. They received isolationist messages from America First and interventionist messages from British security coordination, neither source identifying itself honestly. They heard Roosevelt promise to keep America out of war, while his actions made war more likely. They read newspapers whose editorial positions reflected ownership interests they knew nothing about. They listened to radio programs that seemed informative but were actually persuasive. They watched newsreels that appeared to show objective reality but were edited to create specific impressions. The machinery of persuasion operated at industrial scale, processing public opinion like raw material in a factory. Input: events in Europe and Asia. Output: American attitudes about whether to intervene. The process was not entirely controllable. Real events had impact independent of how they were framed, but the machinery shaped interpretation, influenced emphasis, and guided conclusions. By December 1941, the machines had been running at full capacity for over 2 years. Millions of words had been spoken, billions of words printed, countless images projected onto movie screens. The American mind had been cultivated like a field, ploughed by repetition, planted with messages, watered with emotion, fertilized with selective facts. The crop was nearly ready for harvest, but harvesting required a catalyst, an event so overwhelming that it would sweep away the careful structures of argument and counter-argument. The machines could prepare the ground, but they could not force the final transformation. That would require something the propagandists could not create, or control something that would make all their careful work suddenly irrelevant, because the debate itself had become obsolete. The machines hummed and whirred, processing and producing, advancing their agendas through methods their audiences did not understand and would not have approved if they had understood. The battle for American opinion was being won and lost in ways that made democratic deliberation a fiction. Americans believed they were thinking for themselves. The machinery knew better. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was playing three-dimensional chess while the nation watched checkers. In public, he promised American mothers their sons would never fight in foreign wars. He made this promise 16 times during the 1940 presidential campaign, 16 explicit pledges that no American boys would be sent to die on foreign soil. The mothers heard these promises, believed them, and voted accordingly. Roosevelt won re-election with 55% of the popular vote and 449 electoral votes to 82. In private, a different reality existed entirely. While Roosevelt campaigned on keeping America at peace, American factories were already producing 500 aircraft monthly for Britain. While he pledged neutrality, American pilots were training Royal Air Force crews at airfields in Florida. While he spoke of avoiding foreign entanglements, American warships were hunting German submarines using intelligence provided by British codebreakers. The public Roosevelt and the private Roosevelt inhabited different worlds, pursued different goals, and told different truths. The Lend-Lease program represented Roosevelt's masterwork of political manipulation, a policy sold as helping democracy without sending troops, but which actually committed America to war as surely as a declaration. Introduced in December 1940 and passed by Congress in March 1941, Lend-Lease authorized the president to sell, transfer title to, exchange, lease, lend, or otherwise dispose of any defense article to any country, whose defense he deemed vital to American security. The language was deliberately vague, the powers deliberately broad. In practice, Lend-Lease meant America would produce unlimited quantities of weapons, ships, aircraft, vehicles, food, and raw materials for Britain, and, later, for the Soviet Union and China. The recipients would pay eventually, somehow, in ways to be determined after the war ended. It was a blank check written against America's industrial capacity. Roosevelt called it lending garden hoses to neighbors whose houses were on fire. The metaphor was brilliant. Who could refuse to help a neighbor in distress? But the reality was more like building an addition onto the neighbor's house, furnishing it completely, then expecting eventual repayment in a currency that did not yet exist. By December 1941, $11 billion in Lend-Lease aid had flowed to Allied nations. $11 billion. Convert that to current value and you approach $200 billion. This was not assistance that could be withdrawn without Allied collapse. Britain's war economy depended entirely on American production. Soviet forces fighting German invasion used American trucks, ate American food, and wore American boots. China's resistance to Japan relied on American aircraft and fuel. The economic entanglement meant military involvement was inevitable. You cannot supply armies at war and remain neutral. You cannot provide the tools of survival to one side of a conflict and claim non-participation when the other side retaliates. Roosevelt understood this perfectly. In private conversation with Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, he acknowledged that America was already at war, just not yet shooting. The Lend-Lease commitment made formal declaration a matter of timing rather than principle. Roosevelt was waiting for the right moment, the right catalyst, the right configuration of public opinion that would allow him to acknowledge what he had already decided. Consider what happened in August 1941, when the president vanished from Washington for 10 days. Official announcements claimed he was on a fishing trip, a brief vacation to rest from the pressures of office. The newspapers ran photographs of Roosevelt relaxing aboard the presidential yacht, rod and reel in hand, surrounded by peaceful waters. Americans who read these stories imagined their president enjoying brief respite from responsibility. Actually, Roosevelt was meeting Winston Churchill aboard warships, anchored in Placentia Bay, Newfoundland. The leader of a neutral nation and the leader of a nation at war were planning the post-war world before America had entered the war. They drafted the Atlantic Charter, a document outlining principles for international cooperation after Allied victory, a victory Roosevelt publicly claimed to be neutral about. The Atlantic Charter called for self-determination of peoples, free trade across borders, freedom of the seas, disarmament of aggressor nations, and establishment of a permanent system for collective security. It was a blueprint for the United Nations, written 18 months before America officially joined the war, 4 years before the war ended. Churchill and Roosevelt discussed strategy for defeating Germany and Japan, dividing the post-war world into spheres of influence, and ensuring that Britain and America would dominate global affairs after fascism's defeat. The meeting was secret because revealing it would expose Roosevelt's deception. How could a neutral president meet with a belligerent prime minister to plan war strategy? How could a leader who promised to avoid foreign wars be designing the post-war international order? The contradiction would be politically devastating if Americans learned the truth while Roosevelt still maintained official neutrality. The president's chess game extended to Japan, where American codebreakers had penetrated Japanese diplomatic communications and were reading their most sensitive traffic. Operation Magic had cracked Japan's purple cipher in August 1940, giving America 18 months of access to Japanese diplomatic messages before Pearl Harbor. 18 months of knowing Japan's negotiating positions, strategic calculations, and internal debates about whether to pursue war or accommodation. Roosevelt received daily briefings on intercepted Japanese communications. He knew by November 1941 that Japan was preparing for war if negotiations failed. He knew the Japanese had given their diplomats a deadline. If agreement was not reached by a specific date, military operations would commence. He knew Japanese carriers had departed their home ports, though American intelligence could not determine their destination. He knew war was coming, but calculated that Japan must strike first for political reasons. The president needed American entry into the war, but required Japanese aggression to justify it. If America attacked first, isolationist opposition would explode, and the nation would enter war divided and reluctant. If Japan attacked first, unity would be instant and total. Roosevelt was willing to accept casualties to achieve unity. He told advisers that America might lose 10,000 men in the initial Japanese attack, but would gain unified national purpose, worth any price. This calculation was cold but rational. Roosevelt understood that a divided nation could not wage total war effectively. He understood that isolationist sentiment would not vanish through argument but could evaporate through attack. He understood that the transformation of American public opinion required catalytic shock, not gradual persuasion. So he maintained negotiations with Japan while reading their communications, revealing that negotiations were futile. He positioned forces in ways that invited attack while appearing to prepare for defense. He played strategic weakness when America possessed information superiority. The morality of this approach remains debated among historians. Did Roosevelt deliberately allow Pearl Harbor to occur? The evidence suggests something more nuanced. He knew war was imminent, but did not know precisely when or where Japan would strike. He believed the attack would target the Philippines, America's colonial possession in the Western Pacific, not Hawaii. He accepted that American forces would sustain initial losses but miscalculated the scale and location of those losses. What remains indisputable is that Roosevelt conducted foreign policy at variance with his public statements. He promised neutrality while committing to war. He pledged to keep America out of foreign conflicts, while secretly meeting with foreign leaders to plan those conflicts. He assured mothers their sons would not fight while positioning those sons in locations where combat was increasingly likely. The gap between public promises and private policy created a situation where Roosevelt's effectiveness required deception. A leader who told Americans the full truth that war was necessary, inevitable, and imminent would likely have been blocked by Congress and repudiated by voters. A leader who acted on that truth while pretending otherwise could maneuver the nation into position for necessary action. Roosevelt chose the second path, accepting personal dishonesty as the price of national survival. His critics called it warmongering, manipulation of a peaceful nation into unnecessary conflict. His defenders called it statesmanship, providing the leadership America needed but would not accept if clearly stated. Both interpretations contained truth. Roosevelt was simultaneously manipulating his people and serving their interests, lying about his intentions while pursuing their protection, subverting democratic process while defending democratic values. By November 1941, Roosevelt's hidden chess game had positioned pieces. Across the board, American industrial capacity was committed to Allied victory through Lend-Lease. American forces were stationed in locations where conflict was likely. American intelligence was reading enemy communications. American public opinion had shifted from 96% opposition to war towards something more ambiguous, still majority opposed, but with growing recognition that conflict might be unavoidable. The president had done everything possible short of declaring war. He had provided weapons, training, intelligence, and economic support to nations fighting fascism. He had positioned American forces in harm's way. He had maintained negotiations designed to fail. He had prepared the industrial base for rapid mobilization. He had cultivated relationships with congressional leaders who would support war measures. He had privately promised Churchill that America would fight. What he lacked was the catalyst, the undeniable event that would make his hidden policy, visible policy, transform his private commitments into public action, and unite America behind a war many still wished to avoid. He was waiting for the enemy to provide that catalyst. He would not wait long. The chess game Roosevelt played operated across multiple dimensions simultaneously. On the public board, he moved carefully, constrained by isolationist opposition and electoral politics. On the diplomatic board, he positioned America to support allies without triggering neutrality law violations. On the military board, he prepared forces while maintaining defensive postures. On the intelligence board, he exploited information superiority while pretending ignorance. On the economic board, he committed resources that made neutrality unsustainable. Each board affected the others. Military positioning influenced diplomatic negotiations. Economic commitments shaped political debates. Intelligence insights guided strategic decisions. Roosevelt had to play all boards simultaneously, maintaining coherence across different dimensions of policy while showing different faces to different audiences. Domestically, he was the leader keeping America at peace. Internationally, he was the arsenal of democracy. Privately, he was the war leader preparing for inevitable conflict. The complexity of this multidimensional game required extraordinary political skill and moral flexibility. Roosevelt possessed both. He could tell mothers he would never send their sons to war while positioning those sons for combat. He could promise neutrality while committing to intervention. He could maintain democratic forms while subverting democratic process. Whether this made him a great leader or a dangerous manipulator depends on perspective and outcome. What remains clear is that by December 1941, Roosevelt had played his chess game as far as possible without the catalyst he needed. American forces were positioned. Industrial production was mobilized. Public opinion was shifting, and intelligence was flowing. The stage was set. The pieces were positioned. All that remained was for the enemy to make their move, providing the trigger that would transform hidden policy into open war, private commitments into public declarations, and a neutral nation into the decisive force that would determine the war's outcome. Roosevelt waited, knowing the move was coming, unable to predict its exact form, prepared to respond with moves he had planned months in advance. The chess game was approaching its critical moment, the point where strategy becomes action, deception becomes truth, and the hidden becomes visible. The president sat in the White House, receiving intelligence reports, monitoring Japanese diplomacy, positioning forces, and waiting for the catalyst that would justify everything he had done in secret. Time was running out, but Roosevelt had played his game well. When the catalyst came, America would be ready not because it had been told the truth, but because it had been maneuvered into position through leadership that valued effectiveness over honesty, results over transparency, and national survival over democratic purity. The chess game was nearly over. The final moves were approaching. And Roosevelt, whatever his moral compromises, had positioned America to survive what was coming. Each week of 1941 brought decisions that made war more certain, like dominoes arranged by invisible hands, each positioned to trigger the next in an accelerating cascade toward inevitable collision. The momentum built through actions that seemed individually defensible but collectively pointed in only one direction. America was mobilizing for war while claiming to prepare for defense, arming for conflict while promising peace, and moving toward involvement while maintaining the fiction of neutrality. In January 1941, American military planners completed a document called Rainbow 5. The innocuous name concealed revolutionary content. This was America's strategy for fighting Germany and Japan simultaneously in a global war. Rainbow 5 specified how many divisions would deploy to which theaters, how naval forces would divide between Atlantic and Pacific operations, how air power would support ground campaigns on multiple continents. The plan was comprehensive, detailed, and existed while Congress debated whether to increase the army from 200,000 to 400,000 men. Think about that contradiction. Military planners were designing a two-front global war, while elected representatives argued about whether America needed a larger army at all. The planners knew what was coming. The representatives reflected their constituents who hoped war could be avoided. The gap between planning and politics revealed the deeper truth: the government was preparing for war, regardless of what the people wanted. In March 1941, American engineers began constructing military bases in Greenland. Greenland was technically Danish territory, and Denmark was occupied by Germany, which meant America was occupying territory controlled by a nation we claimed neutrality toward. The legal gymnastics required to justify this action were impressive. America would protect Greenland from German occupation by occupying it ourselves, holding it in trust for Denmark until Denmark could govern itself again. The Greenlanders were not consulted. The bases were built regardless of their consent, because strategic geography trumped legal niceties. By April, American forces had occupied Iceland as well. Iceland had declared independence from occupied Denmark, making them theoretically sovereign. But sovereignty meant little when British and American forces decided Iceland's location made it strategically essential. The island sat astride the sea lanes, connecting America to Britain, providing bases for aircraft that could patrol for German submarines. American troops replaced British occupiers who were needed elsewhere. The Icelanders protested. Their parliament voted against the occupation, but the protests and votes changed nothing. These occupations transformed the North Atlantic. With bases in Iceland and Greenland, American aircraft could patrol 1,000 miles from the American coast. They could detect German submarines, report their positions to British warships, and occasionally attack them directly. This was not neutral behavior. This was active participation in Britain's war against Germany, conducted from territories America had occupied through questionable legal means. Meanwhile, American factories accelerated production at rates that seemed impossible. In January 1941, American aircraft production reached 1,500 planes per month. By June, production hit 2,400 per month. These were not civilian aircraft, but military planes, fighters, bombers, reconnaissance aircraft, transports. Some went to American forces, but the majority flowed to Britain through Lend-Lease. American workers were building the weapons Britain used to fight Germany, while Americans told themselves they were staying out of war. Automobile production was cut by 20% to free steel and factory space for military equipment. The cut was not mandatory but strongly encouraged through government pressure on manufacturers who wanted military contracts. Civilian consumers faced longer waits for new cars while factories retooled to produce tanks, trucks, and aircraft engines. The automotive industry was being converted into the arsenal of democracy before democracy had decided to go to war. By June 1941, the draft had pulled 1,600,000 men from civilian life into military service. These were not volunteers but conscripts, young men required by law to serve in the armed forces. They trained at bases across the nation, learning infantry tactics, artillery operations, tank warfare, and amphibious assault techniques. The training assumed combat deployment, though officially America was at peace and intended to remain so. The economic transformation was undeniable. The unemployment that had plagued America throughout the 1930s was vanishing, as war production created millions of jobs. Factories that had operated at 50% capacity during the Depression now ran multiple shifts. Steel mills, shipyards, aircraft plants, munitions factories, all were expanding, hiring, producing at levels not seen since the last war. The economy had become a war economy operating at 70% capacity, waiting for permission to reach full power. Mathematical models created by War Department planners showed the tipping point approaching. Britain's gold reserves, which paid for American supplies before Lend-Lease, would hit zero in August 1941. At that point, either America would give supplies without payment, or Britain would collapse. There was no third option. The arithmetic was brutal and precise. Britain could not continue fighting without American support. America could not provide support indefinitely without payment, and payment was running out. Lend-Lease solved the payment problem, but created a dependency that made British survival synonymous with American interests. If Britain fell after America had committed $11 billion to their survival, that investment would be lost entirely. The sunken cost created incentive for further investment, each dollar committed making the next dollar more necessary. It was economic logic that led inexorably toward military involvement. Japan's clock ticked louder as the year progressed. In July 1941, Roosevelt froze Japanese assets in America and implemented a complete oil embargo. Japan imported 80% of its oil from American sources. The embargo meant Japan's oil reserves would last approximately 18 months at peacetime. Consumption rates, less if military operations required increased usage. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. Japan must seize the Dutch East Indies oil fields or surrender their empire. There was no middle path. Every day without American petroleum meant burning 18,000 barrels from strategic reserves that Japanese planners knew were finite. They watched the gauges drop, calculated the remaining time, and understood the embargo meant war. America knew this too. The embargo was designed to force Japanese withdrawal from China and Indochina, but Japanese military leaders considered such withdrawal unthinkable. They had spent 4 years and hundreds of thousands of lives conquering territory they would not voluntarily abandon. American intelligence agencies tracked Japanese preparations throughout the fall. Military attachés in Tokyo reported increased activity at naval bases. Signals intelligence detected unusual radio traffic. Diplomatic intercepts showed Japanese ambassadors receiving instructions to negotiate while military forces prepared for war. The signals all pointed toward conflict, though the specific timing and targets remained uncertain. Weather patterns narrowed the window. Japanese strategists needed to seize Southeast Asian territories during the winter monsoon season, when weather would provide cover for their southern advance and hinder American counterattacks. The monsoons ran from December through February. Attack earlier, and weather would not provide protection. Attack later, and monsoons would end, exposing Japanese forces to American air power operating from Philippine bases. In November, Special Envoy Saburo Kurusu flew from Tokyo carrying Japan's final diplomatic proposal. Magic intercepts revealed he did not know his own government had already decided on war. His mission was theater, designed to maintain diplomatic contact while military forces moved into position. Roosevelt received Kurusu cordially, listened to proposals he knew were meaningless, and responded with counter-proposals designed to be unacceptable. Both sides played out negotiations they understood were futile, maintaining diplomatic fiction while preparing for military reality. American forces in the Philippines began receiving reinforcements. B-17 bombers flew from California across the Pacific, arriving at Clark Field north of Manila. Additional fighter squadrons deployed. Ground forces strengthened defenses. The reinforcement had dual purposes. It demonstrated American commitment to Philippine defense while positioning forces to threaten Japanese sea lanes if war erupted. The Japanese noted the reinforcement and adjusted their attack plans accordingly. By early December, the dominoes stood in their final configuration. American intelligence estimated the probability of war at over 90%. Navy Department calculations showed that if Japan attacked, they would likely target the Philippines, possibly Wake Island and Guam, and potentially British possessions in Malaya and Singapore. Hawaii was considered less likely, too far from Japanese bases, too heavily defended, too risky for the limited strategic gain of temporarily disabling one fleet base. The intelligence assessments were logical but incomplete. They assumed Japanese strategy would follow conservative military logic, seeking victories that justified risks taken. They failed to account for the possibility that Japan might pursue a devastating first strike designed to cripple American power projection across the Pacific, accepting high risk for transformative results. On December 6, 1941, the dominoes stood ready. American codebreakers intercepted Japanese diplomatic messages, ordering their Washington embassy to prepare to deliver a message at precisely 1 p.m. Eastern Time on December 7th. The timing was significant. It suggested an attack was planned for that moment, somewhere. The message would be, Japan's declaration that negotiations had failed, delivered simultaneously with military operations. Roosevelt received the intelligence that evening. He read the intercepts and told his advisers, "This means war." He did not know where or when the attack would occur, but he understood the timing of the diplomatic message indicated imminent military action. American forces in the Philippines and Panama Canal Zone received warnings to expect attacks within hours. Hawaii received similar warnings, but with less urgency. The intelligence suggested Japan's focus was Southeast Asia, not the Central Pacific. The warnings arrived at various Pacific bases in different forms and with different urgency levels. Some commanders took them seriously, positioning forces for possible attack. Others considered them routine. One more warning in a series of warnings that had been issued throughout the fall. The difference in response would prove crucial, though none of the commanders could know which assessment was correct until events provided the answer. As Saturday evening became Sunday morning in Washington, the dominoes stood at their final positions. 20 years of peace since the last war. 2 years of secret involvement in the current war, 1 year of accelerating mobilization, 6 months since Japanese assets were frozen, 1 month since the final unsuccessful negotiations, 1 day until everything changed. The time was measured not in years or months, but in hours now, though the people sleeping peacefully across America had no idea how short the remaining peace actually was. The dominoes had been positioned through countless decisions, made by thousands of people, pursuing different agendas that collectively pointed toward collision. Economic interests, strategic calculations, ideological commitments, diplomatic failures, military preparations, intelligence assessments, weather patterns, oil reserves, political pressures, and historical momentum all had contributed to the configuration that existed on the evening of December 6, 1941. One push would topple them all. The push was already in motion, though Americans did not yet know it. Japanese carriers approached their launch positions, maintaining radio silence, hidden beneath weather fronts, moving toward a target that would transform everything. The dominoes stood ready. The first was already falling. and nothing could stop the cascade that would follow. The invisible hands that had arranged the dominoes through the year's decisions now withdrew. The arrangement was complete. The momentum was established. What would follow was no longer preventable through diplomatic negotiation or strategic positioning. The dominoes would fall as they had been arranged to fall, and when they finished falling, the world would be fundamentally different than it had been when they stood. At 7:39 a.m. Hawaiian time on December 7, 1941, radar operator Joseph Lockhart sat in a primitive installation at Opana Point on the northern tip of Oahu, watching green phosphorescent blips on an oscilloscope screen. He was scheduled to shut down the radar at 7 a.m., but the truck that was supposed to transport him and his partner back to base had not arrived. So they kept the equipment running, practicing their tracking skills, watching the screen display the peaceful Pacific morning. At 7:48 a.m., the largest airborne contact ever detected appeared on Lockhart's screen, 137 miles north, closing at 180 miles per hour. The contact was so massive that Lockhart initially thought the equipment was malfunctioning. He adjusted the settings, recalibrated the scope, and confirmed something enormous was approaching Oahu from the north. He called the information center, reporting a contact that appeared to contain more than 50 aircraft. The lieutenant who received Lockhart's call checked the plotting board, saw no scheduled flights from that direction, and consulted with the duty officer. The duty officer recalled that a flight of B-17 bombers was due to arrive from California that morning, approaching from the northeast. He assumed Lockhart had detected the B-17s, told him not to worry about it, and advised him to shut down the radar and wait for his transportation. Lockhart obeyed orders. The radar went dark at 7:54 a.m. At that moment, 183 Japanese aircraft from 6 carriers bore down on the Pacific Fleet, arranged in Pearl Harbor like targets at a shooting gallery. The fleet followed standing orders that concentrated ships for easier protection against the primary threat sabotage by Japanese agents on Oahu. Tightly clustered ships could be protected by fewer guards, preventing infiltration and bomb planting. The orders made sense for the threat commanders expected, but created perfect conditions for the threat they faced. At 7:58 a.m., Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, leading the first attack wave, transmitted the code Tora, Tora, Tora. Tiger, 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 signaling that complete surprise had been achieved. Below him, the Pacific Fleet rested at anchor. 8 battleships lined Battleship Row along the southeast shore of Ford Island. 3 more battleships and numerous cruisers, destroyers, and auxiliary vessels filled the harbour. Aircraft sat wingtip to wingtip at Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, and the Naval Air Station concentrated to prevent sabotage, creating targets that allowed single bombs to destroy multiple planes. The attack began at 8:08 a.m. Dive bombers screamed down on hangars and parked aircraft. Torpedo bombers skimmed across the harbour surface at less than 100 feet altitude, launching Type 91 torpedoes modified with wooden fins that allowed them to function in Pearl Harbor's shallow waters. Horizontal bombers dropped armor-piercing shells converted. From battleship ammunition, projectiles designed to penetrate the thick steel of American warships, the USS Arizona exploded 8 minutes into the attack. A 1,760-pound armor-piercing bomb, dropped from 10,000 feet by a horizontal bomber, penetrated the forward deck near Turret 2 and detonated in the forward magazine. 1 million pounds of gunpowder exploded simultaneously. The ship lifted out of the water, broke in half, and settled onto the harbour bottom in 9 seconds. 1,177 sailors and Marines died instantly, nearly half the total American casualties that morning, killed in less time than it takes to read this sentence. The USS Oklahoma took 3 torpedoes in the first minute of the attack, then 2 more in rapid succession. The battleship rolled to port, capsized completely, and settled upside down with her hull exposed above the waterline. 429 men were trapped inside the overturned hull. Some spaces remained watertight. Trapped sailors tapped on the hull, sending messages in Morse code to rescuers who could hear them but could not cut through thick steel quickly enough. The tapping continued for 16 days, before the last man died, suffocated, dehydrated, driven mad by darkness, and the knowledge that help was impossibly close but unreachably far. The USS West Virginia took 6 torpedoes and 2 bombs. The ship settled upright on the harbour bottom, preventing capsizing but trapping men in compartments below the waterline. Rescue crews cut into some compartments, saving men who would otherwise have drowned. But in the deepest spaces, watertight and flooded, men survived in air pockets for days. When the ship was finally pumped out months later, workers found corpses that had marked calendars, tracking the days until death came. The last calendar showed 16 days had passed. The USS California took 2 torpedoes that flooded engine rooms and damaged power systems. The ship might have been saved, but damage control efforts were hampered by the fact that Saturday was recreation day. The ship was undermanned, watertight doors were opened for convenience, and ammunition lockers were locked because liberty meant less threat from accidents. The California settled slowly onto the harbour bottom over 3 days, a gradual sinking that allowed most crew to escape but lost the ship nonetheless. The USS Tennessee and USS Maryland were inboard ships, protected from torpedoes by the vessels moored outside them. They survived with relatively minor damage. The USS Nevada, moored alone at the north end of Battleship Row, took 1 torpedo and attempted to get underway. Seeing a battleship moving, Japanese pilots concentrated their attacks on the Nevada, hoping to sink her in the harbour channel and block the entire port. The Nevada's crew beached their ship deliberately rather than sink in the channel, accepting damage to preserve Pearl Harbor's utility. At 8:40 a.m., the first attack wave completed its mission and withdrew. 20 minutes later, the second wave of 171 aircraft arrived. They found the harbour obscured by smoke, anti-aircraft fire now fully organised and intense, and the element of surprise lost. The second wave focused on ships that survived the first attack, on airfields, and on port facilities. Their success was more limited but still devastating. By 9:45 a.m., the attack was over. The Japanese had delivered 866,000 pounds of ordnance in 110 minutes of precision violence. 21 ships were destroyed or damaged, 8 battleships, 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and 7 auxiliary vessels. 188 aircraft were destroyed, mostly on the ground, caught in neat rows before pilots could reach them. 2,403 Americans were dead, 1,178 were wounded. The Japanese lost 29 aircraft, 9 of them from the first wave, 20 from the second. 5 midget submarines sent to penetrate the harbour were lost with all hands. Japanese casualties totaled 64 dead. The exchange ratio was extraordinary. For every Japanese killed, approximately 38 Americans died. The human mathematics of Pearl Harbor can be calculated but not comprehended. 2,403 dead. If you wanted to read all their names aloud at a normal speaking pace, it would require approximately 40 minutes. If you attended a funeral for each victim and spent just 1 minute at each service, you would stand in mourning for 40 continuous hours. If you wanted to shake hands with each dead man's immediate family, parents, spouse, children, assuming an average of 4 family members per victim, you would make 9,612 separate condolences. Consider the geography of grief. 2,403 families received telegrams. Those families were distributed across 48 states. In some towns, multiple families received telegrams on the same day, a community's entire generation of young men killed simultaneously 5,000 miles from home. Gold Star mothers, who had organized against intervention, now hung gold stars for sons they thought they had protected by keeping America neutral. The isolation they had fought for had provided no protection when the enemy came to Hawaii. The quantum collapse of American opinion was instantaneous and total. On December 6th at 7:47 a.m., polls showed 88% of Americans opposed entering the war. By December 7th at 7:48 p.m., 1 million volunteers had overwhelmed military recruitment offices. The shift was not gradual evolution but instantaneous transformation from overwhelmingly opposed to unanimously committed in less than 12 hours. Charles Lindbergh, who had addressed crowds of 30,000 advocating neutrality, attempted to enlist in military service. The Army Air Corps refused him. His pre-war statements had made him politically toxic, and the military wanted no association with the most prominent isolationist in America. Lindbergh would eventually contribute to war production as a civilian consultant, but he would never receive the combat command he sought. Pearl Harbor had made his previous advocacy not just wrong, but poisonous. The America First Committee held an emergency meeting on December 8th. 850,000 members, $15 million in funding, 450 chapters across the nation, all dissolved within 4 days. The organization that had been the largest political movement in American history voted itself out of existence rather than oppose a war that had just killed 2,403 Americans. Their final statement acknowledged that the debate was over, the question was settled, and America would now prosecute the war with complete dedication. Senator Burton Wheeler of Montana, who had compared Lend-Lease to plowing under every fourth American boy, voted for war without speaking. Senator Gerald Nye, who had spent years investigating corporate war profiteering and arguing that economic interests had dragged America into the previous war, voted for war and never again questioned the decision. The entire isolationist movement, which had comprised 23 million active supporters, ceased to exist as a political force between Sunday morning and Monday afternoon. Roosevelt's war message to Congress required 6 minutes and 30 seconds to deliver. 500 words carefully crafted to unite through rage rather than divide through reasoning. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The speech contained no discussion of complex international relations, no explanation of events leading to conflict, no acknowledgement of prior American actions that had pressured Japan. It focused entirely on the attack itself, on American casualties, on the betrayal of conducting negotiations while planning attack. The rhetoric was designed to transform complicated geopolitics into simple morality, good attacked by evil, innocence assaulted by aggression, freedom threatened by tyranny. Congress voted 470-1 for war. Only Representative Jeannette Rankin of Montana voted against. She had also voted against entering the First World War in 1917, maintaining pacifist principles across 24 years despite overwhelming political pressure. She cast her vote, left Congress, and never returned. Her political career ended, but her principles remained intact. Within 6 months, the American industrial machine that had been idling at 70% capacity roared to 130%. Factories operated 3 shifts daily. Women entered the workforce by millions, replacing men who deployed to combat theaters. Automobile production stopped entirely, all factory capacity devoted to military vehicles. Steel mills produced at levels exceeding their designed capacity. Shipyards that had built 24 vessels in 1941 produced 700 in 1943. Planners had calculated mobilization rates based on First World War experience, assuming gradual expansion over years. Instead, America achieved in months what models predicted would require years. The difference was unity. A nation moving in the same direction without internal resistance accelerates beyond theoretical limits because the friction of dissent has been eliminated. Pearl Harbor provided that unity. The attack was so devastating, so surprising, so clearly aggressive that it answered every argument isolationists had made. They had claimed the oceans protected America-Japanese planes proved otherwise. They had argued that Asian conflicts did not threaten American interests. The burning fleet demonstrated that isolation was impossible in modern warfare. They had insisted that avoiding entanglement would preserve American lives. The 2,403 dead revealed that non-involvement offered no safety. The 110 minutes from 7:58 a.m. to 9:45 a.m. on December 7th, 1941, transformed everything. America entered those minutes as a divided nation, deeply ambivalent about foreign commitments, officially neutral in the greatest conflict humanity had yet produced. America emerged from those minutes as a unified war machine, committed to total victory, mobilized for unlimited effort, and psychologically transformed from isolation to global engagement. The transformation was irreversible. There would be no returning to the pre-war mentality, no restoration of the illusion that America could remain separate from world affairs. 110 minutes of violence purchased decades of American global dominance. Though no one recognized the trade at the time, they saw only smoke rising from Pearl Harbor, heard only the cries of wounded sailors, felt only rage at betrayal and determination for revenge. The physics of the transformation would take years to fully manifest, but the fundamental change occurred in those 110 minutes when isolation died and engagement was born. Pearl Harbor triggered an irreversible phase change in American society, analogous to water becoming steam, the same molecules arranged in an entirely different state, occupying vastly more space, possessing vastly more energy, and incapable of returning to their previous form without complete cooling. The transformation was thermodynamic, following physical laws as immutable as gravity. The energy released could not be recaptured, the momentum generated could not be stopped, and the new state could not revert to the old without losing all the heat that had driven the change. Consider the isolationist movement. On December 6th, it comprised 23 million active supporters, organized into 450 chapters, funded with $15 million, and commanded the allegiance of major corporations, prominent intellectuals, and ordinary citizens across every state. By December 8th, it had ceased to exist as a meaningful political force. The energy that had sustained isolation memories of the First World War's costs, skepticism about European entanglements, determination to preserve American lives did not disappear. It underwent conversion. The same energy that had resisted intervention now powered the war effort. Mothers who had organized against foreign wars now organized scrap metal drives. Businessmen who had funded isolationist propaganda now managed war production facilities. Senators who had opposed military build-up now competed to show who could authorize larger military appropriations. The energy remained constant, as thermodynamics requires, but its direction reversed completely. Resistance became support, opposition became advocacy, and restraint became unleashed commitment. American factories that produced 3,000 automobiles daily on December 6th were producing 300 military aircraft daily by June 1942. This was not a gradual transition, but a rapid phase change. Automobile assembly lines were disassembled, reconfigured, and rebuilt for aircraft production within months. Workers who had installed car doors and windshields retrained to rivet aluminum aircraft fuselage sections. The machines were different, but the principle remained mass production of complex equipment, just redirected from civilian to military purposes. The conversion rate exceeded all predictions. War Department planners had estimated that converting automobile factories to aircraft production would require 18 to 24 months. The actual conversion averaged 6 months. The difference was intensity of commitment. When an entire nation moves toward one goal without internal resistance, when workers understand that production directly affects whether their brothers and sons survive in combat, when every delay potentially costs American lives under those conditions, people work faster, solve problems quicker, and achieve what models predict is impossible. By 1943, American war production surpassed the combined output of all Axis powers. Germany, Italy, and Japan together could not match what America produced alone. In that year, American factories built 85,000 aircraft, 24,000 tanks, 47,000 artillery pieces, and 18 million tons of shipping. These numbers are abstract until you consider what they mean every single day. American industry produced 233 aircraft, 66 tanks, 129 artillery pieces, and 49,000 tons of ships. The Manhattan Project expanded from 12 scientists in December 1941 to 130,000 workers by 1945, 12 to 130,000 in 42 months. The growth was exponential, following mathematical curves that described chain reactions, each addition enabling further additions, each breakthrough requiring more researchers to exploit it. each facility demanding more workers to operate it. By 1945, the Manhattan Project had consumed $2 billion, equivalent to approximately $30 billion today, making it one of the largest scientific investments in human history. The project built entire cities that did not officially exist. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, grew from farmland to a facility employing 75,000 people in 18 months. Hanford, Washington, expanded from near-empty desert to a complex housing 50,000 workers in 2 years. Los Alamos, New Mexico, became a laboratory employing thousands of scientists and engineers in a location that did not appear on maps. These phantom cities consumed electricity at rates rivaling major metropolitan areas, used water that required massive infrastructure projects, and produced materials whose purpose remained secret even to most workers producing them. The army expanded from 1,600,000 soldiers in December 1941 to 12 million by mid-1945. 12 million men and women removed from civilian economy and transformed into military force. Each soldier required an average of 67 pounds of equipment that had not existed before Pearl Harbor: uniforms, weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, communications gear, vehicles, rations. Multiply 67 pounds by 12 million, and you calculate 804 million pounds of equipment manufactured, specifically for military personnel. But equipment represents only direct military needs. Each soldier required support, infrastructure, training facilities, transportation systems, housing, food supply chains, medical facilities, administrative systems. Economists calculated that each soldier in combat required 7 to 10 workers in support roles, manufacturing their equipment, transporting their supplies, maintaining their facilities, processing their paperwork, treating their wounds. 12 million soldiers meant between 84 million and 120 million people dedicated to military support functions in an economy whose total workforce comprised 60 million. The mathematics seems impossible until you account for women entering the workforce in unprecedented numbers. 6 million women took factory jobs during the war years, positions previously reserved for men. They welded ships, assembled aircraft, operated machinery, and performed tasks that pre-war society had declared inappropriate for women. Rosie the Riveter represented not merely propaganda but demographic reality. Women constituted approximately 37% of defense industry workers by 1944. The phase change extended beyond economics into culture. A society that had been deeply divided about foreign policy became remarkably unified about war aims. Dissent did not disappear entirely. Some religious pacifists maintained opposition. Some communists initially opposed the war until Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Some critics questioned specific tactics or strategies. But the overwhelming majority of Americans supported the war effort with remarkable consistency across 4 years of sacrifice. That sacrifice was not trivial. Rationing affected every household. Gasoline limited to 3 gallons per week for non-essential drivers. Butter and meat restricted to specified quantities. Sugar severely limited. Rubber nearly unavailable for civilian use. The rationing created hardship but also unity through shared sacrifice. When everyone faced the same restrictions, when wealthy and poor alike waited in the same rationing lines, inequality of sacrifice, which had poisoned public opinion about the First World War, was minimized. The thermodynamic equation proved irreversible. America could not return to isolation after expending such energy. 500,000 Americans died defeating fascism. 500,000 families who would never forgive forgetting why their sons died. 407,316 dead. If you lined them up single file with 3 feet between each person, the line would extend 232 miles. If you drove past at 60 miles per hour, it would require 3 hours and 52 minutes to pass them all. These numbers are not abstract. They represent permanent transformation of American society's relationship with the world. The investment created permanent entanglement. By 1945, America maintained 400 overseas military bases on every inhabited continent. The logistics required to supply those bases, the relationships created with host nations, the strategic interests they represented all made returning to pre-war isolation impossible. America had built global infrastructure that could not simply be abandoned without losing the investment made to create it. American economic dominance at war's end was unprecedented in human history. The nation controlled 70% of world gold reserves, the ultimate measure of wealth in that era. American factories produced 50% of global industrial output. One nation, with 6% of world population, manufactured half of everything manufactured anywhere. American agricultural exports fed Europe and Asia. American merchant fleet carried global trade. American dollar became the international currency of exchange. This dominance emerged directly from the phase change Pearl Harbor triggered. America entered the war with the 18th largest army in the world, smaller than Portugal's, inadequately equipped and trained. America exited the war as the undisputed dominant military and economic power. The transformation required enormous sacrifice, but produced benefits that shaped the remainder of the 20th century. Consider the butterfly effect of America's 2-year delay in entering the war. If America had joined Britain and France in September 1939, France might not have fallen, the Holocaust might not have accelerated to industrial genocide, and the Soviet Union might not have expanded into Eastern Europe. The casualties prevented could have numbered in the millions. But America in 1939 had the world's 18th largest army and possessed none of the weapons that would prove decisive long-range bombers, proximity fuses, amphibious landing craft, atomic weapons. The delay allowed development of SNAR-FRAS, superior technology. The B-29 bomber, which would destroy Japanese cities and deliver atomic weapons, did not exist in 1939. The proximity fuse, which revolutionized anti-aircraft defense, was not invented until 1940. The atomic bomb required uranium enrichment facilities and plutonium production reactors that would have been impossible to build while simultaneously fighting a major war. The technology that made American victory possible emerged during the years of official neutrality. The WW2 amphibious vehicle, which enabled beach assaults, was designed in 1942. The Liberty ship, which allowed rapid replacement of submarine-sunk cargo vessels, was not conceived until 1941. The Jeep, which became the universal military transport, entered production in 1941. Radar-equipped night fighters, which defeated German bomber formations, did not exist until 1941. The 2-year delay, frustrating as it was to those already fighting fascism, allowed America to enter the war with weapons that did not exist when the war began. The atomic bomb represented the ultimate consequence of delayed entry. The Manhattan Project required $2 billion and 4 years to develop working weapons. If America had entered the war in 1939, those resources would have been consumed by conventional warfare. The atomic bomb might not have been developed until 1947 or 1948, by which time the war would have been decided through conventional means that killed many more people. Instead, atomic weapons ended the Pacific War without the invasion of Japan that planners predicted would cost 1 million American and 10 million Japanese lives. The bombs killed approximately 200,000 people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a horrific toll, but orders of magnitude less than Operation Downfall, the planned invasion, would have killed. The mathematics of hypothetical casualties suggests the delay saved lives despite prolonging the war. The ghost of isolationism has haunted every American military intervention since Pearl Harbor: Korea, Vietnam, Lebanon, Somalia, Iraq, Afghanistan. Each debate about intervention featured arguments about avoiding foreign entanglements. Each deployment faced opposition, warning against repeating Vietnam's mistakes. Each commitment raised questions about whether America should be the world's policeman. Pearl Harbor's lesson that waiting for perfect clarity means accepting catastrophic surprise competes with Vietnam's lesson that intervention based on unclear objectives leads to unlimited commitment without achievable goals. The permanent revolution Pearl Harbor triggered began at 7:58 a.m., December 7, 1941. A nation that wanted only to be left alone became guardian of a world order it never sought to create. The transformation was irreversible, not because Americans chose permanent engagement, but because the alternative, returning to isolation after demonstrating the capacity and willingness to project power globally, would invite exactly the kind of surprise attack that Pearl Harbor represented. America's phase change from isolated republic to global hegemon followed physical laws as inevitable as thermodynamics. The energy released could not be recaptured. The momentum generated could not be stopped. The new state could not revert to the old. The molecules remained American, but their arrangement had fundamentally changed. The transformation was complete, permanent, and irreversible. And it all began in 110 minutes on a Sunday morning, when the phase change started, the old state ended, and the new state emerged hot, expanded, energetic, and utterly different from what had existed before the catalyst struck.